Thanks, Mary. I'm delighted Mary made me a bit younger because I qualified in '92. It seems a fair distance away now. Couple of things before I start. I hate standing at a podium when I'm teaching. Students from UCD won't know me because I haven't taught them yet. I teach a third-year module on ethics and law, so you'll have me next January. And they know that I like to walk around, but because of the interaction here and with Patrick, I have to stay here. So forgive me if you think I'm getting agitated, because I've had to stay in one spot for a while. It's interesting that we picked this day for this talk because this is BE Day, 1945, May the 8th. It's also the day that Let It Be was released as a single by the Beatles. And it's also the first day of the sighting of the new royal baby, name to be yet determined. So Mary's asked me to work on this session around ethics. So I'm going to bring us through kind of some of the theory of ethics and how I think it works in regards to health and whether it works or not, and what I think is more applicable in health settings. And then I'm going to look at how can we bring a decision-making model to ethics and ethical issues that arise. Because from my perspective as a teacher of ethics and also an educator of healthcare professionals, every decision we take as a healthcare professional has an ethical or legal element to it. Nothing we do doesn't require us to weigh up the balance of two choices. And I think a model for decision making is helpful. And I'm going to bring you to a couple of cases. One, some of you might recognize some of the people on the clip. It's taken from a daytime soap called Doctors. I'm not a fan of the program, but I liked this clip because it gives us an insight into some of the things that we might overlook as ethical issues that arise. And I do think that there will be time for questions as well. And if there's an issue that you want to bring up from here, or if you prefer to talk afterwards, I'll be around for a little while afterwards. Ethical issues for many can be identified as this bomb ready to go off at any moment. I would always suggest that an ethical issue becomes a dilemma if it's not addressed, and that dilemma can turn into a crisis if we choose not just to continue to ignore it. As I said, ethics for me is really something that's influenced by how we are developed morally. And there are a number of influencing factors. We can see culture, how we are reared, how we are brought about into this world. Spirituality, and whether or not that spirituality is based on a religious belief system or not, how we ask those existential questions of what is it about me when I have a diagnosis of a condition that's either chronic, life-limiting, and maybe fatal, and what are those questions that arise which are ethical? What's going to happen to me? Who's going to look after me? And do we as healthcare professionals see those questions as ethical for the person who's diagnosed? Because they are. Customs. There's this wonderful saying that we did it that way and we're always doing it and we're not changing. And that's based on custom. And custom is something we should all be challenging in healthcare because things change. Our personal ethics are built on by everything else, all those other influences. But also, we are informed as we go through our life, how we interact with others, what we read, what we see on TV, whether we believe in the fake news of Donald Trump or the reality of what we can see and read ourselves from other sources except Fox. Our personal perspective is informed by a myriad of different issues. Our psychosocial makeup, how we react to change, how we react to situations where our opinion is asked. How often has somebody who we call patient, client, or service user come to you and say, well, what would you do? If it was you, what would you do? Am I going to get better? Am I going to die? How will my family cope after I'm gone? What would you do? We are influenced by the law. We are given laws that we have to live by. Some we mightn't agree with, but hey, that's the reality of living in democracy, or so we think. Traditionality of practice. You know, what I'm going to talk to you about ethical theory is that we have traditional theories that are still being used, but we also have more contemporary and modern theories that are taking their place, are adding to our interpretation of those traditional theories. And I suppose for me, the most important influencer is our family. And that's our family, whether that's our biological or our logical family. What do I mean by that? The biological family is the one that we don't get to choose, but the logical family is the one that we do get to choose. And sometimes that logical family is more close to us than our biological family. And that's important in the context of health. I want to premise a lot of what I'm saying to you by saying that we hear a lot about next of kin in healthcare. There is no legal definition of next of kin in the context of healthcare. We have a piece of legislation around advanced care planning and shared decision-making going through our parliament, which will allow a person to nominate a co-decision maker or an alternate. But we don't have a legal definition of next of kin in the context of decision-making. We do have a next of kin definition in the context of inheritance. So we're able to define who we want as next of kin in the context of who I'm going to leave the mortgage to, but I can't identify, legally, there is no next of kin defined under Irish law as yet. We nearly had it, but our learned politicians in Dáil Éireann and the other houses of doctors chose to take it out. And that was a definition that was promulgated and put into the original heads of the bill of cohabiting couples, which eventually allowed for same-sex marriage in a subsequent bill, but it was taken out of the heads and never replaced. So influences on our moral thinking. So some of what I'm going to say to you about moral theory might be already in the brain, somewhere back at the back, then I'm going to tease it back out to the forefront again. So looking traditionally, we have one theory called utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is what's called a teleological theory. Teleology, not theology, the God stuff, it's teleology. It's all about consequences. So if I choose to work from a utilitarian perspective, what I'm looking at is the greatest good for the greatest number. It's based on the work of a guy called Jeremy Bentham. And what he said was that happiness is measurable. And the ultimate outlook of us as human beings is that we all want to be happy. For some, happiness is finishing a job on time. For others, it's having enough money on the credit card to go shopping once a month for things outside of food, for enjoyable things. For others, it's about having time with family. But what makes us happy is very subjective. But Bentham said that our object as human beings is to be happy. So therefore, happiness could be measured. And what's better for our happiness than to be useful? Great thinking in that era of the Industrial Revolution in the United Kingdom and its territories, where if you weren't useful, you were cast aside. So this utilitarian ethic, where do we see it in health? It really is looking at how we see consequences. What are the goals? And in the utilitarian thinking, I am a means to an end. So whatever I need to get done to get the good end is acceptable. So utilitarian thinkers will actually justify war because we're ousting a dictator by invading a country. In healthcare, we use utilitarianism as a theory of the greatest good for the greatest number by advocating for vaccinations. And vaccination programs are only good and useful and make us happy as a society if enough people take them up to avoid a spread of a pandemic. There's an opposing theory, and that's the theory from deontology, this duty ethic. So after Bentham's work and some work by J.S. Mill, you had a guy called Immanuel Kant, very interesting chap. He grew up in Prussia. He worked as a teacher, but he was sacked because he was exceptionally violent towards his students. He believed using the rod to spare the child a little bit too much. So the parents of the children ran him out of the village in which he was a teacher. Apart from that, he was actually a profound philosopher, and he actually developed this idea that and challenged the thinking of utilitarian thinking. He said, this is ridiculous. You can't measure happiness because of the absolute subjectivity of it. How can you make an objective measure of something so subjective? And he said, all this utilitarian thing is all about the greatest good for the greatest number. But what about the individual person? Where does the individuals reside? Where does me as an end in myself and not a means to an end? Because utilitarian thinking was, you are a means to an end. I will step over you to get to my maximum goal. He was saying, no, you can't do that. You can't cast aside the individual. So if we look at that from the context of health, what does it mean to have a deontological theory in health? It means that we treat everybody individually. So we all provide individualized, person-centered or patient-centered care, which seems to be in line with deontology. But it goes further. It says, actually, you don't do to one person what you won't do to anybody else. That maxim taken from the Christian side, which was do unto others as you want them to do yourself. That was a major influencing factor on his writing. And interestingly, what he said is that it is the golden rule. You act in that way that you would have others to act towards you. So in the context of the extreme deontological position in healthcare, it means that every time somebody rings a bell who's a patient, client, or service user, they must be answered individually. And if that means in a 6-bedded bay that there's 6 people to answer those bells, that's ultimate deontological theory, which is a bit ridiculous given the circumstances we're in, where we're confined with budgets, etc. But it was in opposition to that. And what I would suggest is that when we come to use these traditional theories, we see a mix of both. We see that we have to respect the individuality of the person and their rights within that context of having that individualized and personalized care, and that every person feels equitably treated. But we have to be mindful that they are one of many in a service that has a finite budget that has to be shared among many for the greatest good. That brings us then to the more contemporary theories, and we start with one that we'll all be familiar with, which is Principleism. And you will all have heard of the 4 theories, the 4 schools under Principleism: beneficence, to do good; non-maleficence or non-malevolence, to avoid harm; the theory of and the principle rather of justice; and the principle of autonomy. So let's look at beneficence first. Beneficence is about doing good and avoiding harm, and non-malevolence is its opposite. It's about preventing harm. And those 2 principles are based very much in the Hippocratic tradition of that Hippocratic oath, primum non nocere, first do no harm. And it really is about recognizing that we like to be beneficent and non-maleficent in how we perform our duties as healthcare professionals. But how often did you get the hump when somebody said, actually, would you ever go away? I really don't want you around. Because it's very hard to take as a healthcare professional when you're not wanted. We like to be told, oh, thanks a million, you're so good, you're an angel. I don't know how you do this work. Those of us working on hospice, you tell people outside that I work in the hospice, oh, how can you do that work? That kind of, that as Robert Speck calls it, that quintessential imperative to be nice when we work in hospice. Well, actually, sometimes you have to be not nice. But it's that idea that we try to do good and we try to avoid harm. Then we look at justice, and it's not justice in the sense of the law courts. It's justice in how we are fair and equitable and how we provide care to those who need it. And that's something as simple as we arrive to work in the morning and we look at our plan of care for the day and we decide who needs most time with me, or who do I need to see first because they need a lot of help. Or, do you know what, I'm going to do the ones that don't need me much this morning first, so I have time to spend with those who need me more. That's applying that principle of justice and equity and fairness. It's not this big, massive theory. It's actually putting it into grassroots. How do I manage my time so I'm fair and equitable to everybody who needs me? And the final principle is that principle of autonomy, which is problematic because it comes from this, the word itself, autonomous, self-rule. Now, I would argue that we have a very white, male, middle-class, Judeo-Christian ideology when we look at autonomy, because it's self-rule, it's me, myself, and I, and it's what I want that is all important, and I will decide. But in actual fact, there are more cultures and more communities around the world that use a shared autonomy, where it's not the individual who's unwell that has to be left to make their decisions. Rather, it's a shared decision-making with the family, the logical family, and the community who are there to support them through their journey of illness. So it's important that we recognize that there's very different ways we think about autonomy, that it's not just the personal autonomy. And the difficulty we have with personal autonomy is that you can only be autonomous if you have the information upon which to make a decision. And how many times have you met people that we call patients, clients, and service users who don't know their diagnosis, don't know their prognosis, don't know why they've been admitted to a service, or have been told, you're the pain nurse, you're coming to visit them in their home to talk about managing their pain, when you're actually, in fact, you're a member of the community palliative care team. So how can I self-rule if I don't have all the information? And how we manage that information is a legal argument that we're going to leave for another day. So that's our principleism, and that's, I say, is the most often used contemporary moral theory. And it is about balancing those principles, about doing good, avoiding harm, being just, and recognizing the role the person has in their own decision-making, which is central to everything that's written in Sláinte Care, which is a new health policy that will try to be implemented, but we'll see it on a shelf gathering dust in about 5-10 years' time. That's the cynic in me coming out. Another contemporary moral theory is this narrative ethic. This is really interesting because it asks us to look at the person as person and not patient. It challenges us. And to look at the person who has a narrative that began long before they came into contact with us because of their diagnosis. And that narrative is not just about their diagnosis, it's about them. An interesting way that I've seen this actualized is when they built the new hospice in Cork and Marymount, and in the Greenfield site, they one of the things they put in the rooms of the hospice site was whiteboards. And everybody said, what in the name of God you put whiteboards? Why would you do that? And it was about seeing the person. So those whiteboards became the storyboards of the person who was in the bed. Some people used it, family members used it as, mum likes 2 sugars in her tea and don't put the milk in first. Others used it to show that their father had been a member of the Irish Armed Forces and had served in the UN and had pictures all over the whiteboard. So this was person before patient. And it was all about that narrative that sees us seeing the person as who they are. And all of us here in this room and in Blackrock, we are people first. We're professionals after. Another school of thought is this idea of an ethic of care. Ethic of care is based on the work of a lady called Carol Gilligan and her work called A Different Voice. And an ethic of care really works for healthcare, but there's a school of thought which says it's in opposition to the ethic of justice that was espoused by Lawrence Kohlberg, who was a psychologist and happened to be Carol Gilligan's tutor. So if we look at Kohlberg, what he said is that we develop our moral thinking in a very step-by-step process. There are 3 steps we take, and there's 2 bits that we have to do in each step. But 85% of us won't get past the 4th step. So we'll get through 2 stages and 4 steps. But only 15% of us will get to the top line. Gilligan challenged him on that and said, actually, we all think differently. And the reason she challenged him was because he was basing his study, and he was basing his findings of the 85% saying that only men could get to the top levels. But his study was flawed because he only studied boys over a 20-year period. Gilligan challenged and said, you know, my studies have indicated differently that men and women think differently. And challenged and developed this ethic of care, saying, yes, there are developmental ways we do moral thinking, but it's not linear. It's not one step after another. We come in it at different times, different moments, when there are different ethical questions arising for us. Unfortunately, her study was a bit flawed as well, because she only studied women. But why does it work as a contemporary moral theory? It works because it calls us to see that we work from that duty perspective. Not just the deontological stringent duty, but rather when we establish a relationship that's therapeutic in nature, there is a duty on us to care for that individual, even if we can't stand them. if their voice grates on us, if we don't agree that they should be even treated by us because they've done this to themselves, we still provide the care and we leave our judgment at the door. And I argue, and I continue to argue, that nobody in healthcare provides non-judgmental care. It's a fallacy. We judge all the time. We make clinical judgments, but we also judge on how people are dressed, the color of their hair, how they speak. You've all made a judgment about me since I started talking, and I've done one on you. Because guess what? I'm a human being and I make judgments. It's how I use that judgment. So I would always say, don't talk about non-judgmental care. Talk about non-discriminatory care. Because guess what? We have a piece of legislation that says, on these grounds, you cannot discriminate, and it covers everybody, the 9 grounds. So that ethic of care challenges us to be the best we can be in the context of a therapeutic relationship. Interestingly, there's another contemporary moral theory that speaks very much to the caring professions. Irrespective of what research you read, all the caring, or the majority of care is provided by females. In any relationship that is heterosexual, whether it's a man and a woman, the majority of the care is provided by a female. So it's important that we recognize that feminist thinking can actually influence how we do ethics. And it's recognizing that the female thinking process is different and actually incorporates a different vision of how things should be done. And a more recent moral theory that's coming from the contemporary thinking world is around relational ethics. Really a lot of work being done in Edmonton in Canada. Fantastic center for the study of relational ethics there. And what is it about? It's this relationality that we have as human beings. We are in relationship with many different people, groups, bodies. And it's recognizing that that relationality has an impact on how we engage with the wider world and each other. So they're the theories. So all this bloody theory, how do we apply it? It really is recognizing that it can actually help us, believe it or not, in how we make an ethical decision. We have these wonderful texts called Codes of Conduct that provide for our ethics and our moral thinking from the Nursing Midwifery Board for Ireland, the Irish Medical Council for our medical colleagues. And all of these are the same colour because they're from the same body, CORU, which is for our health and social care professionals who are clinical therapists, social workers, dietitians, speech and language therapists, physiotherapists, and occupational therapists. And they're all fantastic documents because they're based in work that was done with the body of people who are these individuals. So for example, when the Code of Conduct for Nursing and Midwifery was developed and we got it published in 2014, this was done using a Delphi technique with all of those who taught nursing ethics in the 13 schools of nursing. So we decided as a body that we wanted a principle-based approach to ethics, and that it would be underpinned by the UN Convention on Human Rights and also by our legislation on that challenges us to not be discriminatory. And what it does is, and what all of these documents do, and they're worth a read irrespective of what profession you're in because they can teach us something wonderful, is that they can give us guidance about how we think about things. And they can give us a direction in how we make decisions. They are very helpful because they're used when something goes wrong. They are informative and directional, but it's only one item that's used for judgment if something goes wrong. So what is it about ethics that we need to think about when we're making a decision, besides applying the code of ethics? It's recognizing that in order to make that good ethical decision, to solve what we perceive to be a dilemma or an issue, it's about having sensitivity to the issue, and having a method that is practiced and perfected over time to explore what the ethical issues are and the aspects of the ethical issue and determine the decision. One of the things I would say to you is that whilst I have decision on the slide, I would always argue that you can never fully solve an ethical question, issue, dilemma, crisis. Because solution requires 100% agreement. And we're human beings, we're never going to get that. You only get that in elections in North Korea. It will require us to resolve the issue. And that means that some of us in that decision-making group will have to recognize that we're going to have to change opinions slightly and take the majority position. And it also means that we have to bite our tongue and not, if it goes wrong, come back and say, told you so, should have listened to me, I was in the minority. That's not what it's about. It's about recognizing that any decision we come to that is based on an ethical parameter is not an individual decision and should never be. No one person should be liable to try and resolve an ethical issue. It should be the multidisciplinary team working together to resolve that issue. It is about applying a method that I'm going to talk about shortly. And then it's about recognizing, is there a principle that's guiding me? Is there a theory? Is there a code I can draw on that can actually help me to get to that decision? But also, is there a policy that is hindering me more than helping me to actually provide that ethically based and sound care? So to define an ethical dilemma, it's a situation with uncertainty about what's right to do from both a moral or ethical perspective. I want to mention a word about those terms, moral or ethical. There is a subtle difference. And philosophically, the difference is that ethical is about the right, wrong, good or bad, bearing in mind that things that are right aren't necessarily bad and things that are wrong aren't necessarily good, and vice versa. Okay, that's just to confuse everybody. We do right things that are actually bad, and we do bad things that are actually wrong. But we also do right things that are bad. Yeah? An example, I will give an injection which pierces somebody's skin and causes pain to relieve pain. So I'm doing something that's actually not nice, bad, but it's for the right action at the end. So just because it's right doesn't mean it's good. Just because it's wrong doesn't mean it's bad. That's the ethical. The moral tends to be focused on issues of the body. And that's because of the traditions that we have across Europe, is that it comes down to the S word, that it's all about sex. Unfortunately, that's the way things are written. But we need to actually challenge that morality thinking, that it isn't just about one aspect of our lives, it's about how we live our entire life as sexual beings, but not just about the sex act. So I'm going to introduce you to a 5-step model that I think is really handy because it's quick and easy to use. And it's about the process. That's the important bit. The conclusions will be different based on how you look at it, based on the person who looks at it, etc. So I'm going to look at each one of these stages separately. But it's really about getting the facts, looking at the ethical maxim, looking at where time comes into it, extenuating circumstances, and then bringing your judgment to a conclusion. So how do I gather information? It really is important when we're looking at things ethical, we deal only in fact, not opinion, not hearsay, fact. What are the facts of the case? Why are we doing that? We're doing that so everyone's off the same page and we are allaying any confusion, so that everybody knows this is what we're looking at. These are the facts of the case. This is what we're focusing on. It's not my opinion. It's not what anybody else said. It's not a third person. It's what are the actual facts of the case. The maxim, are we looking for something theoretical that's going to help us from the world of the utilitarian, which is looking at the consequences? So then I ask the question, what are the benefits of this action? What are the negatives? If I'm a duty person, I look at, well, are there any rules? Were the rules misunderstood? Would it be better to try and apply a more contemporary theory? So could I actually base my decision on applying the principles from a principleism theory? And it's also important to recognize that we might draw from a number of theories to help us with that issue, that no one theory will provide us the absolute answer. We can draw from others, which is important to recognize. Time is very useful. In some instances, time is of the essence, but in others, we have a little bit of time to consider. And time allows us to get a good handle on the first step, which is gathering information. We also need to look at things prior to the situation that we're looking at, this issue. So what was going on in the person's life up to this point? What was going on in their healthcare? What was going on in their life? What was motivating them? And in this instant of an ethical issue that's arising, what's the intention? And intention is really easily to define when it comes to something like murder versus manslaughter. So the illegal act of murder versus manslaughter. Murder, there was intent, it was pre-planned, premeditated. Manslaughter, it wasn't. It happened on the spur of the moment. We need to ask those same questions in the context of the ethical issue that arises. Was this something that the person has spoken about before? Is this something that we've seen before? What's the intention here? What's our motivating factor? What's going on in this person and in this issue? During the context of the issue, we're looking at, are there rules that we need to follow? Are there unwritten rules? Are there things that we have done before when considering an ethical issue that will be helpful? Are there things that would be a hindrance that didn't help the last time, so let's not go there this time? And then we have to look at what are the consequences. So if we take this decision and we follow through on our plan using this outcome, are there consequences? Are there consequences that I can't think of? Are there potential consequences? Or I'm open to consequences that I haven't considered. And sometimes that's okay, to recognize that we may not be able to fully articulate consequences of how we act and what we will act. It is also important to recognize that in some instances there are circumstances that need to come into our thinking. And again, this helps us to complete the step of articulating the facts of the case. So important considerations. I've given two examples here. The Everest climber. Okay, some of you might be hill walkers. So have you ever thought about in advance, what happens if somebody falls, dies? Do I leave them there and keep going? Or do we wait for rescue and circle them and pray for their repose of their soul? So have we ever thought about something in our lives related to an issue and thought about it and actually stopped and thought about it and decided, actually, you know what, I'm going to leave that and go back to my gin and tonic? Or, you know, this is what I would have done. That idea that when climbers go on Everest, they make a decision beforehand. If this happens, this is what we will do. If this happens, this is what we will not do. So it's very clear. So do we do that in the context of engaging in discussions about treatment, options for treatment, options for withdrawal of treatment, etc. The other consideration is an interesting one from our perspective as healthcare professionals, and it was this case of nurses and physicians who had to make decisions about euthanizing patients during the course of Hurricane Katrina, where you had a number of patients who were ventilatory supported, and they had to decide who had the best possible outcome because electricity was shutting down and they had only so many generators to actually keep ventilatory support going. So decisions had to be made about who was to be euthanized and who wasn't. Interestingly, the American Medical Association has upheld the decisions made by the intensivist who had to carry the burden of the final arbitrator of that decision. And that's why I said it's important that it was a team decision. But there are civil cases being taken by family members who died. But what's interesting is that they had to sit, even in that trauma of a hurricane, where they were waiting for rescue to happen, they had to make these difficult decisions, and they had to look and explore the consequences of what was going to happen. And they were difficult decisions, but it was a team involvement. But the only person that's being sued is the intensivist. She's done a huge amount of TED Talks, well worth a listen, because she just explores this whole ethical side wonderfully well. And the final step in our decision is looking at how do we render judgment. And that can be very much dependent on what's our ethical base, what's my personal feeling, what's coming to me from theory, what's coming to me from the facts. Very important to recognize it's not always that black and white, that it's either this or this. There's always a gray area, and we spoke. I spoke to somebody outside about the grey area, and ethicists, they have what's called ethicists in North America who actually do all this work, and they actually can cause you to ask more questions than answer. But it is this wonderful sentiment they have, is that there is no black and white. There's always a little grey area. But I think it's important that when we come to a resolution, we need to provide the evidence and the reasons why we've chosen to take a particular stance and why we're going in this particular direction. And the important thing is that it is the process that's important. The outcome will differ, but the process is what gets us there to a resolution and a potential outcome that we're going to achieve. I think there are a number of elements that we need to consider in how we approach any ethical dilemma, ethical issue, ethical crisis. Again, it's the specific ethical problem. Is it an ethical problem, or is it a care problem? Or is it a psychosocial issue that could be addressed with intervention? So is it an ethical problem? Are we balancing issues of two sides of a coin that we need to come down and try and articulate what's the best option? The facts, the facts, the facts. What questions do I need to ask to arrive at a decision? And if there is a decision to be made, or rather the resolution I talked about, who makes it? And I would argue that if it is the MDT. Yes, in Ireland we have consultant-led services, but those services are provided by a multidisciplinary team, some of whom have more interaction with people we call patients, clients, and service users. So we should have a team approach to decision making. Yes, I recognise the significant role my consultant colleagues have in leading the team and having to articulate and rationalise at other times, but I think having the team behind you supporting that team decision will make that easier. I think the moral principles, and I would say that for me, the most applicable for a lot of what we do is the theory of principleism, that recognizing, doing the good, avoiding the harm, being just, and incorporating autonomy in wherever way we see it in the care of the individual we have. It's also important to think, again, this is going back to my utilitarian thinking, is that I think it's important that we look at myriad options and consequences. If we can articulate those, it makes it easier. But sometimes we may not see that there's a consequence to how we will act. It's easier when you're dealing with kids because you know the consequence of them putting their hand on the fire or on the fire grate, they're going to get burned. But dealing with us as adults and the complexities of adulthood, because we all have our own mindset, it can be difficult to predict consequences. But I really believe that we should address the issue in the context of an ethical care that really includes the compassionate discernment of the patient's wishes and their best interests. And all of codes of ethics talk to that element of the best interests and the personal wishes of the individual. And sometimes we have to challenge those personal wishes and preferences because sometimes they may be unrealistic. And actually it's about being real with the person and actually gently challenging whether this is a real thing that could be achieved as a personal preference or wish. You know, what's interesting is that all of the literature suggests that people would prefer to die at home. But if you dig down into the sample are all healthy people. If you ask people who are unwell, where do you want to die? Last place they'll say is at home, because they don't want their families to be burdened. They don't want the family home to be remembered as a site where they died and where there was sadness. And actually they see how sick they are and they say, actually, if I had a choice, hospital or hospice, because I don't want that burden on my family. But everybody tells us people want to die at home. Yeah, when they're healthy. Who's going to answer it otherwise? But when people are sick, ask them the question then. Very different response, and it has been done. That question has been asked of a sicker population. I want to share a scenario with you just to kind of get us thinking about how easy ethics comes into the play. This is the clip from, and it worked earlier on, and technology is wonderful when it works, but Garrett's here in case it doesn't. This is the clip from that wonderful afternoon, what do they call them? Soap, thank you. Doctors. Again, I don't watch it, but I liked the clip because it's interesting, that perspective. So we'll have a look at this. Watch out for the ethical issues.
So it's not cancerous or anything?
No. Seborrheic keratosis would be as we get older, it's like bonkers and should lie.
So it's all right to treat it. And you're not supposed to mess around with this, are you?
No, it's perfectly fine to deal with this straight away.
Do I have to go down to hospital?
No, we can deal with this research quite easily.
Oh.
I only need to spot a liquid nitrogen. Wait here.
What, right now?
It's really quite straightforward.
Will it hurt?
Not at all. I use it all the time with my children. It's not really normal walk. Okay? Right. Okay.
Hi. Hello, it's Connolly Health Centre. Okay, can I have your name and date of birth, please? Okay, that's 65 Bedford Road. And it's about the chlamydia test. Okay, right, it looks like the test results have come back from the lab, my dear, but I don't have the details yet. I think it's best that we book an appointment with Dr. Turner. Looks like you need review on your marble arm anyway, so you might as well kill two birds with one stone. Would you like to fix an appointment now, or do you need to check this first?
No, I can make the appointment.
Okay, Friday, right?
I don't get out until 3:30.
Right, 4 then?
Okay.
Okay, let me just put that in. So that's Nadia Cross, 4 o'clock, Dr. Turner. That's done? Okay then, bye.
The joys of television. Let's look at some questions, and colleagues in BlackRock, feel free to join in with this discussion. So let's look at the first bit of that scene, which was the lady in the doctor's office. So what do you think are the ethical issues that you can identify there? You can shout out and I'll repeat it for people to hear. Okay, so permission to, yeah, he mentioned the treatment, but as you say, he didn't actually formally ask permission. It's grand because it's done on kids, so it won't hurt. Actually, it does. You know, using liquid nitrogen does actually hurt. And so he didn't give her information. He didn't explain. Lack of information. Yeah. Dignity was out the window, so therefore confidentiality was out the window. Like your man coming out from the other office, the other doctor had a great view and took his time and had a good look, see what was going on. Despite the fact that there was actually a curtain around the examination bed that could have easily been pulled. Yeah, informed consent is a big thing there. Like the argument could be that, well, there was an implied consent because she didn't actually say no, but actually a formal question needs to be asked. I'm going to use this to actually, it will be called, there may be some pain. Are you happy for me to continue? No, he just said, I'm going to do this, popped off, got the machine and come back in. Yeah, so informed consent is an issue. Anything from BlackRock that you saw in that first bit?
No, we couldn't hear it very clear.
Okay, apologies about that. We'll send it on anyways to everybody who was attending. We can actually share we're recording this, so we'll be able to watch it back. Addressing those issues then is really a question we need to consider. How would we actually address those? So you're the practice manager, how would you address it? Absolutely, and it is just saying very gently to a colleague, actually, you can't leave somebody exposed like that. You know, that's what the curtain is there at the door for. Maybe close the door when you leave. You know, we're all very good at the document stuff. You know, with GDPR, we have to turn off computers and we have to clear screens before we leave an office. But actually, sometimes we have to kind of think twice about leaving people exposed in a different way. And I suppose that's what I'm trying to get at here, is that we tend to think of ethics as these big, big questions, but actually this type of thing happens regularly. You know, people being left exposed, people actually not being asked their permission even to take a blood pressure. You know, it's assumed, and we can assume that somebody raises their sleeve when you walk in with a sphig, that's fine. But even just to recheck, is it okay if I take your blood pressure? I think we can all agree what we would do differently. Lots. You know, it was less than a minute of a clip, and I counted at least a dozen issues that I would have have there that we could address very easily. The second scene is quite interesting. So what are the issues there for you? This is the receptionist taking an inquiry about results and sharing knowledge about the results of her chlamydia test with everybody in the waiting room. And it's not even that the name is shared. The address is also shared. So one of her neighbours is sitting at home, yeah, and the judgment is automatic. Oh, we know what that one was up to, she got chlamydia. Okay, so again, the ethical issues. It's confidentiality, yeah, yeah. It sounds so simple, but how many of you have actually been in that situation where somebody, you're in a waiting room and there's a call and you can hear every single thing what's going on, you know? And it is recognizing that we have this tendency in a lot of our healthcare environments to think that because of the curtain, that's a wall and no sound protrudes. Alan Corrie-Finn is the executive director, a retired executive director of the Western Trust in the north, and they closed their hospital. I think they closed. They opened in Fermanagh. They closed in Tyrone. Tyrone became a tertiary referral centre, and they built this beautiful new hospital in Fermanagh. Purely political, and he'll tell you that. But all of the rooms, there are only shared spaces in that entire hospital, are the A&E department and the mortuary. Every patient is cared for in a single room. We have that now in a lot of our spaces across our campus. But this is an acute hospital. Every bed is in its own room. And one of the things that came up in conversation kind of 6 months after they opened, they did a review of how things were going and blah. So he met, as the executive director, he met with the director of nursing locally, the director of nurse managers, the clinical managers, the medical director, etc. And one of the big complaints was that ward rounds were taking a lot longer. And Alan kind of said, well, why is that? Why do you think that is? It's terrible. People are asking questions. It's taking us forever. Imagine patients were asking questions about their healthcare because they all had a room with a door, so the team were trapped, but they were theirs to ask questions and they weren't worried about the next person hearing because there was a door and a wall between them. So it's that idea of how do we actually try to maintain that dignity of confidentiality in a shared care space. Bearing in mind that some of the population we're dealing with may have hearing difficulties. So let's look at alternatives where we can bring somebody to have privacy if they have a hearing difficulty. Simple little things. And I think it's easier about how do we address things innovatively and intuitively. I've always said that in health we have intuition and we shouldn't be afraid to use it. Because it's intuition that actually gets us to see beyond what the patient and their family is telling us. What would we do differently? You know, somebody needs to talk to the receptionist and say, you can't be doing that, you know. Now, I'm glad to say that that clip comes from about 7 years ago. So things have moved on and they have a glass partition around the reception area in that surgery. There's another case I'd like us to consider. It's not on video, it's on screen. Apologies about there's lots of text there. This is about Anne, who's a 55-year-old lady, and she's caring for her partner Andrew at home. And that was until about 4 weeks ago. Was admitted to a palliative care unit. He has a diagnosis of MND, become increasingly dependent on Anne for his daily care needs, and reached a point where she's no longer able to manage him at home. She comes from a large and close family of 4 sisters. He comes rather from a large family of 4 sisters, and they visit and support him regularly, but they were shocked and very angry about the decision to admit Andy to the unit and the speed with which that took place. Since admission, his condition is gradually deteriorating and he can no longer eat. Fluids are continually present, but Anne's aware that a meeting is scheduled to discuss this. So his sisters are very concerned at Anne's having agreed to food being stopped and are adamant that the fluids will continue at all costs. Situation has resulted in some tension between Anne and her sisters-in-law. Interesting one, because it does speak to some of the client group we may encounter across our campus. So again, I wanted to try and address the question of what are the ethical issues for you that arise in this situation of Andy with an MND diagnosis admitted to our unit. Food, problematic now, stopped. Fluids continuing, but the conversation is pending. So what are the issues for you that are arising here? Patient's wishes and preferences. So do we know them? Can he communicate them to us? Has he communicated them to Anne or to others who he trusted? His logical as opposed to his biological family. Anything else that springs to mind? Absolutely. What's about? It's about his comfort, yeah. So what is it that we can do to actually increase that comfort and that improve quality of life based on his definition of quality of life, not ours, yeah. That question totally about when do we start the conversation about withdrawal of care or withholding care, and it is that difficult question of when is the best time to start it, not just before it happens. These conversations with somebody who has this diagnosis should be happening when they've been confirmed in their diagnosis, so we can gently prepare what's going to happen. Where in some instances, when people have a diagnosis that is life-limiting and likely to be fatal, we can prognosticate in some areas. It's much more difficult to prognosticate some of the chronic illnesses from respiratory disease and heart failure. But for some of the cancers and for things like MND, it's easier to prognosticate. So it's about distinguishing about when the conversations should start. And I would always suggest that the earlier the better. So that it's not a fear factor. It's not something that's a surprise, but that we're looking at planning for the future. I'm a West of Ireland nosy Parker. How many of you have a will? How many of you have talked about advanced care planning with your loved ones for health? A significant number less than of will. So we find it's more important to plan for who's going to get our material belongings than who's going to make decisions about our health if we can't make them ourselves. Or we haven't articulated our preferences. I've told my beloved where I want to be minded in my dotage if I can't be minded at home, because I know where I'll be minded the way I want to be, which is showered regularly, lots of activities, and a drink in the afternoon. I've made it quite clear. There's a list of what I want. How many of us are afraid to do that, yet we expect patients to do it? And a lot of the writers on advanced care planning would argue that we can't engage in conversations with others about advanced care planning if we haven't done our own, because we're just leading them up a garden path when we're not honest and open about it with ourselves. And it's not about sharing what our plan is. It's about saying, I've had this conversation, I know it's difficult, but it really is important. And more important when we get the legislation that allows the person to either decide for themselves 100% or share that decision-making 50% or assigning that task, if they're not able to do it themselves, to somebody else. I suppose one of the things to conclude with is that, as I said, ethics is in everything we do in healthcare. Ethics is an issue that will become a dilemma, that will become a crisis if we're afraid to actually address the question. And addressing it in a way that allows us to use theory, apply it, and use a model for decision making. And there are difficult questions, but if there's a team of us to look at trying to address it and answer it, then we can arrive at that resolution, recognizing that we won't solve everything, because the virtue of being human. Thanks a million. Hope that's of interest. Happy to take questions.